I have no doubt that in about 200 years' time, the people who occupy my patch will find one of these, one of my pipes lying around the place, and no doubt they'll take it to the local museum and ask them what it is. And the curator will look very wise and he'll say, well, for about 4 centuries, from the 16th century to the 20th, there was a sort of religious ritual whereby they used to stuff these things with a certain dried herb and set fire to it and suck through it. And that went on until the 20th century, until there was a change in society and a new priesthood came in, and the burning of that herb became taboo. And instead, people went over to indulging themselves with the chemical products of certain plants of the poppy family. I assure you that will happen, because some of the things that get into museums every day now, which people ask questions about, when I was young, in particular places, because life was local then, everybody knew exactly what they were. For instance, can you imagine what that is? Handmade for the job, made by the workman himself, probably with the help of a blacksmith, perhaps from a little bit of an old reaping hook. And there was a time when in the wooded parts anyway, everybody knew this as well as people nowadays might know my pipe. And this is a commonplace tool in the time when everything was done by hand. A very sharp edge right down there and a screw on the end. And it was used particularly for 2 things. Can you imagine what? Can you imagine 2 reasons why ordinary people making most of the things for their own lives should want to bore a tapered hole? Well, the answer is that it bored the bung holes in barrels, and it also bored the holes in which the ladder makers put the rungs of a ladder. And this was a ladder maker's or auger, I think you would call it, yes. And these 2, which look at first sight as if they might have had the same purpose, except this one is made of wood, beech, hardwood, and this is made of stone, a sort of shale. This was what we call a clog. The rope of a horse's halter went through a ring on his manger and then through there and a knot on the top. So this acted as a weight. And when the horse was eating from his manger, he could lift, raise his head and drop, and the rope was kept tight all the time, so it never slacked off, so you put his foot over it and get caught up. A stable clog. And people say to me that as soon as they see this, it must have been the same thing. But as a matter of fact, it wasn't. And I'll tell you in a minute what it was. For the moment, I've got something else I want to show you. We were looking a little while ago at the ornamental plaiting of the horses' manes in order to put them on show. And it occurred to me that there is another trick with a horse's mane that it might entertain you to see, which can rarely be seen in England and couldn't have been seen in England at all until recently, because it belongs to a particular breed of horse. The horse of the Vikings and the Norsemen, what is sometimes called the Icelandic pony, or in other strains is called the fjord pony of Norway. First time I ever saw one of these ponies was a Hollywood film called The Vikings. And the chaps with the horns in their helmets were tearing about on these ponies. My friend John Holmes, the animal trainer, had brought one of them over, and this is she. And you'll notice something about her. The northern breeds of ponies, the primitive breeds of ponies, had down there, they were nearly all tan or yellow in some respect, some sort of tone, and they had right down their backs a little stripe. little dark stripe along the spine. It was called the eel stripe. And when it got to the tail, you see it bunched out as part of the tail and became a sort of woolly stripe through the tail. And in the mane, it did the same thing. And when the mane is long and it's hanging down over the side of the pony, you can't really see it at all, except a sort of cloudiness within the mane. But if you do what the Vikings did with it, and what's still done with it in Scandinavia, you hogged it. Hogging a horse's mane is cutting it short so it sticks up straight. The manes of rocking horses were always represented as hogged when I was a child. If you hog it, and then with your sheep shears, which is what he's doing, we used actually to shear sheep with those things for machines, and half make your arm ache too. And if you hog it differentially so that the two light sides of it are cut low, and the eel stripe standing up in the middle of it is cut higher, you get a most picturesque rocking horse effect, which is characteristic of these ponies, and it's their badge. They're absolutely smashing ponies. They're quiet and strong and very intelligent. The only thing is, we got one disadvantage. They're born in wild mountainous places, and their mothers say to the children, every time you see anything, eat it, because food is hard to get. And so the devil of it is to keep the fat off them. That sort of thing. They'll knock you down for food, even when they're so fat that you really want to get the weight off them. Another thing that could sensibly end up in a museum, except it looks like nothing at all, and therefore it would be difficult to explain why it was there, is this. I wonder if you imagine what that stick was cut for. It's a particularly fine stick. It looks like any other stick, perhaps to a non-stick person. But the fact of the matter is, it's a piece of blackthorn. It's a piece of blackthorn which is nearly 1 inch in diameter, level all the way. And it's dried over the years since it was cut, as hard as iron. Once upon a time it had a great big thorn on every one of those scars. And that, in fact, was what that was used for that I was showing you. Those thorns were taken off with it like that. And thus the stick was smoothed, and it was a broom maker's handle knife. It was used by broom makers, rake makers, and all the people who wanted to dress sticks. And this one, which might have been the handle of a shepherd's crook, you wanted something as hard and strong as that for that. Once upon, in ancient history, it would have been a splendid spear handle. A Roman soldier in Britain would have been delighted to get hold of this. But the reason for this one was much more fascinating. In the old days, we used to have rams with horns. These horns belonged to the last of the western tups that we had to father our crossbred lambs. And when they went out in the fields in the autumn to serve the ewes, once they'd served their own ewes, they would try and bash through the hedge until they could get at the ewes next door, or bash through the hedge to get at the ram next door in order to fight it out with him. And there was no sheep wire in those days, or even, in most cases, barbed wire. They were just the cut-and-laid hedges, which you know very well, and they bust the hedges to bits because a ram is enormously strong. So you cut a rail, and you put the rail on his horns like that, and he came out in the field like that, wearing it with it tied on his rail. And when he tried to bash his way out of through the hedge, then he was absolutely defeated. I think the sheep were probably glad to see him, because most of the year the rams sit at the other end of the field like old gentlemen in a club talking about past times, and they take absolutely no notice of the ewes at all. And then the time comes when the ewes are suddenly biologically attractive, and at that point he would be turned out in the field. But he'd be turned out in the field with his rail on, so he couldn't disappear across country and make a mischief of himself. And when the 2 or 3 old ewes saw him coming out like this, wearing his gear, then I'm perfectly sure they thought, ha-ha, things have started again. Well, there we are. Now in a minute I'm going to come back to these. That, as I say, is a stable clog. This is not. If it had been slightly smaller and had a stick in it, it could be a throwing stick that they used to use for hunting squirrels. Even when I was young, some people used them, a Stone Age weapon when they hunted squirrels for food. If it was smaller still and had a spiked stick in it, it could have been the most ancient of tools, a woman's tool, which was a spindle. That's how they made their spindles, to give them weight to spin. When they first spun a thread, way in ages long ago, almost the first piece of apparatus that a woman had to exercise her skills. And in a minute or two, we'll take a look at what's derived from it. I think that my fascination with the art of spinning is actually based on guilt, because my great etc. grandfather, James Hargreaves, invented the spinning jenny. He was the man who got the women out of the cottages into the loom sheds of Lancashire and Yorkshire, and he was the man who made obsolete the spinning wheel. And perhaps understandably, he was chased out of town by his workmates and fled to Nottingham. However, I have one friend, Elizabeth Gilbert, who has never taken the slightest notice of my ancestor and has continued the art of spinning in all its forms. Not only that, but she has been overseas to travel and lecture and to learn the art of spinning in some, as it's done differently in other remote places. I love to watch her at work. Now, for instance, she's going to spin an ordinary woolen thread, the sort of yarn that you would use perhaps for knitting an island sweater. And you notice she's been picking the wool from particular parts of the fleece, because one thing that a woman had to know before she was a spinner, or spinster as the word became later, was how the different pieces of the wool, the shoulders, the belly and so on, and the different breeds of wool are used for different purposes. And she puts the wool through these two carding combs, boards with myriads of tiny spikes on them, which when she works it this way will pull every thread, every of the fleece out straight. So that each is pulled out and they lie individually side by side. And having done that, she turns it over on the back and rolls it up into a sausage. And there's a sausage of neatly extended threads all lying together. And she has a basket full of those before she starts spinning. And the spinning wheel goes round and round, and by a belt made simply of a thread, it drives the spindle, and she feeds the wool into the spindle at a very light tension, just extends each of these sausages in turn and lets it go quite quickly, producing a not very hard twisted thread, or yarn as I think I should say in the case of wool. And then the threads all catch up with one another with their tiny invisible hooks, and then she causes the next sausage to catch onto the edge of the thread by the same method, and once again she does it. This art of spinning is really an art because it depends on long experienced feel of tension and so on. It's on a good day a woman will spin well, on a bad day she'll spin badly, and as she gets more and more experienced at it, she'll spin instinctively. Her hands will do the things by feel while she talks to her friends or sings with her friends, because this long extended activity with all the women sitting together at each other's back doors was the time of all the talk, the time of all the gossip, and it was the time of all the songs. All the old Hebridean songs and the favourite peasant songs came into existence in groups of spinning women. Elizabeth told me that in one of her travels, when she was talking to spinners in far parts of the world, one of the women said to her, "Spinning is the woman's world. No man can ever enter it. No man can ever understand the spirit of it." And now you see she's doing something different. She's now spinning a worsted thread as opposed to a woolen thread. And what she does now is to take the lumps of wool uncarded and spin them at a much tighter tension, putting a much more twist in them. See? And just causing one lump of uncarded wool to catch hold of the previous one, and that sort of thing. And this produces a much harder, stronger, less friendly thread, actually. This is a thread that's used for a man's coat, perhaps, and certainly not for a soft sweater. Now, wool, of course, they spun from the very beginning in Britain because they had sheep from the very beginning. And but that wasn't all they spun. On the farm when I was young, we had in a bottom drawer 2 pairs of sheets, linen sheets, which had been woven from flax grown on the farm, spun on the farm, and woven in the loom in the attic by the visiting weaver who used to come round. He was a suspect character. He spent a long time in the house when the men were out in the fields, and there were many children in the district who were believed to be sons of the weaver. That sort of thing. This linen thread comes from the inside of the blue flax plant, the stems of it. It's extraordinary. It looks like quite a hard stem. There's a skin on the stem, and there's a hard core on the stem. And in between those two lie these fibres, and they have to be got out by being soaked. I think they call it retted, until the skin rots, and then beaten out and then dried. And now that she's got them, she has to do this with it. She has to arrange them all over one another in what is called a tress. Marvellous how many of our words come from the old-fashioned things that people did for centuries, like spinster. This is a flaxen tress, and in all the novels they talk about people having flaxen tresses, and you must admit that it does look very like a beautiful fair-haired girl's head of hair by the time she's finished with it. And it goes on this distaff. This is the distaff, which will hold the tress and keep it in a position to be spun. She ties it on the top of the distaff with the ribbon that's round her waist, tying it with the middle of the ribbon, leaving 2 long ends, and then she folds it over itself like this, more and more like a handsome head of hair. Puts the distaff in its stool. She could carry about. In the old days they used to carry a distaff about over their shoulder and spin from it with a spindle, even when they were walking down the road. And then the rest of the ribbon is used to tie that together like that. And this beautiful flaxen thread comes off the distaff and is spun on the spinning wheel in exactly the same way. And there's a tremendous art in this, because they can spin anything from the finest linen thread, which was used for the most beautiful linen handkerchiefs, all the way to a thick linen thread that would produce a linen canvas apron for heavy work, which was almost indestructible. But it can be only done with your hands wet. It won't work with dry hands. And so you watch yourself dipping her fingers. Look at that thread come out of there. You watch her hand, and it needs that little bit of damp to make it work. And so our hand went in and out of the bowl, and that in its turn would happen quite instinctively, while talk and singing went on, and she had one eye on the pot and the other on the children. Nevertheless, her hand would always go into the thing. And there is a linen scarf, which she has woven from a heavy linen thread spun by herself. And that's worth a bit more than man-made fibre. Now this is a surprise because this is silk. You don't probably expect women to spin silk, because we all believe, in fact, that that the silk is automatically spun out of the chrysalis of the silkworm, which is dropped into hot water and the thread pulled out. But while this is happening, you get a lot of waste and short thread and so on, and stuff which doesn't quite work right. And this is always called, in the extraction of silk, the slub. And this slub was taken by the women and spun to make a heavy silk thread. And slub silk is a word that's used nowadays still. Elizabeth gets this from one of the few silkworm farms that are in England. She takes their slub and she spins it. It used to be on a great deal in India. There's a place, I think it's called, in India, called Tussore, where this was done. And this used to produce the heavy Tussore silk, which the high-class English used to wear in India. You'd see a man with white cock feathers in his hat and a white silk thing. And he would be wearing Tussore silk, which was slub silk. And there, in turn, is a slub silk scarf, once again woven from what she has spun. Now that spinning wheel was in itself a development. There's an original spindle. It doesn't have a stone on the end in this case. It has a wooden disc, but it's the same original thing, and she just gives the spindle a twist and then feeds it and that sort of thing. And I've seen women in Yugoslavia standing in the mountains with a distaff over their shoulders, spinning with a spindle like that. And then the time came when somebody discovered you could put a flywheel on the spindle, and that was the first spinning wheel. They hadn't invented the treadle yet, so that was called the Great Wheel. Elizabeth is one of the only people I know who's got one, and there she is spinning exactly like they spin on the Bayeux tapestry, on the early pictures of English life. So that's all that follows from this. This, which I said, might be the weight of a spindle. I told you what it might be, but I never told you what it was. Well, the truth of the matter was it was the weight, stone weight, from a salmon poacher's net. We found this net in the bottom of a sea trout pool where these roller weights, 3 of them were left and hadn't been carried away from the current, and they were still fastened to the remains of the net. And so we knew exactly what they were. Chaps would come along at night with the net and drop it in and pull it up against the current with those weights rolling and get away with them. That's what it was. And now I'm due on the board.